Little House on the Prairie series by Laura Ingalls Wilder. Book 8, These Happy Golden Years. Chapter 3, 1 Week. As she went trudging through the snow, Laura made herself feel cheerful. Mrs. Brewster was hard to get acquainted with, Laura thought, but she could not always be cross. Perhaps this evening would not be unpleasant. So Laura went in, snowy and glowing from the cold, and spoke cheerfully to Mrs. Brewster. But to all her efforts, Mrs. Brewster answered shortly or not at all. At supper, no one said a word. The stillness was so sullen and hateful that Laura could not speak. After supper, she helped with the work again and sat again in the darkening room while Mrs. Brewster silently rocked. She felt sick from wanting to be at home. As soon as Mrs. Brewster lighted the lamp, Laura brought her school books to the table. She set herself lessons and determined to learn them before bedtime. She wanted to keep up with her class in town, and she hoped she could study hard enough to forget where she was. She sat small in her chair, for the silence seemed to press against her from all sides. Mrs. Brewster sat idle. Mr. Brewster held Johnny asleep on his lap and stared into the fire through the stove's open draft. The clock struck 7. It struck 8. It struck 9. Then Laura made an effort and spoke. "It is getting late, and I'll say good night." Mrs. Brewster paid no attention. Mr. Brewster started and said, "Good night." Before Laura could hurry into bed in the cold dark, Mrs. Brewster began to quarrel at him. Laura tried not to hear. She pulled the quilts over her head and pressed her ear tight against the pillow, but she could not help hearing. She knew then that Mrs. Brewster wanted her to hear. For Mrs. Brewster said she'd not slave for a hoity-toity snip that had nothing to do but dress up and sit in a schoolhouse all day. She said that if Mr. Brewster did not put Laura out of the house, she'd go back east without him. She went on, and the sound of her voice made Laura feel sick. It was a sound that enjoyed hurting people. Laura did not know what to do. She wanted to go home, but she must not even think of home, or she might cry. She must think what to do. There was nowhere else to stay. The other 2 houses in the settlement were only claim shanties. At the Harrisons, there were 4 in the one room, and at Mr. Brewster's brother's house, there were 5. They could not possibly make room for Laura. She did not really make Mrs. Brewster any work, she thought. She made her bed and helped with the kitchen work. Mrs. Brewster was quarreling now about the flat country and the wind and the cold. She wanted to go back east. Suddenly, Laura understood. She isn't mad at me. She's only quarreling about me because she wants to quarrel. She's a selfish, mean woman. Mr. Brewster did not say a word, Laura thought. I've just got to bear it too. There isn't anywhere else I can stay. When she woke in the morning, she thought, I have only to get through one day at a time. It was hard to stay where she was not wanted. She took care to make no work for Mrs. Brewster and to help her all she could. Politely, she said good morning and smiled, but she could not keep on smiling. She had not known before that it takes 2 to make a smile. She dreaded the second school day, but it passed smoothly. Clarence idled instead of studying, and Laura dreaded that she must punish him again. But he knew his lessons. Perhaps she would have no trouble with him. It was strange that she was so tired at 4 o'clock. The second day was over, and the first week would be half gone at noon tomorrow. Suddenly, Laura caught her breath and stood stock still on the snowy path. She had thought of Saturday and Sunday, 2 whole days in that house with Mrs. Brewster. She heard herself say aloud, "Oh, Pa, I can't." It was whimpering. She was ashamed when she heard it. No one else had heard. All around her, the prairie was empty, white and far and still. She would rather stay there in the clean cold than go into the mean house or go back tomorrow to the anxious school day. But the sun was setting, and tomorrow it would rise. Everything must go on. That night, Laura dreamed again that she was lost in a blizzard. She knew the dream. She had dreamed it sometimes, ever since she really had been lost with Carrie in a blizzard. But this blizzard was worse than before. Now the stinging snow and the wind's hard blows tried to drive her and Carrie off the narrow sofa. Laura held on to Carrie with all her might for a long time. But suddenly, Carrie was not there. The blizzard had got her. Laura's heart stopped in horror. She could not go on. She had no more strength. She sank down, down into the dark. Then Pa came driving from town on the bobsled. He called to Laura, "How about going home for Saturday, half pint?" Ma and Mary and Carrie and Grace were so surprised. Mary said happily. Oh, Laura. Ma's whole face lighted up with her smile. Carrie hurried to help Laura take off her wraps, and Grace jumped up and down, clapping her hands. Charles, why didn't you tell us? Ma said, and Pa answered, Why, Caroline, I said I'd do a little hauling. Laura's little. And Laura remembered how, at the dinner table, Pa had drunk his tea and pushed back his cup and said, Guess I'll do a little hauling this afternoon. Ma said, Oh, Charles. Laura had not gone away from home at all. She was there. Then she woke up. She was at the Brewsters, and it was Wednesday morning. But the dream had been so real that she still almost believed it. Pa might come to take her home Saturday. It was like him to plan such a surprise. There had been a snowstorm in the night. She had to break her path to the schoolhouse again. The early sunshine was faintly pink on miles of pure snow, and every little shadow was thin blue. As Laura plunged and plowed through the soft drifts, she saw Clarence breaking a path for Tommy and Ruby behind him. They floundered in the school shanty's door at the same time. Little Ruby was covered from head to foot with snow. Even her hood and her braids were snowy. Laura brushed her and told her to keep her wraps on until the room was warmer. Clarence put more coal on the fire while Laura shook her own wraps and swept the snow through the cracks between the floorboards. The sunshine streaming through the window made the shanty look warm, but it was colder than outdoors. But soon the good stove's warmth made their breaths visible. It was 9 o'clock, and Laura said, School will come to order. Martha and Charles came in panting 3 minutes late. Laura did not want to mark them tardy. They had to break their paths the whole mile. A few steps in deep snow are easy and fun, but breaking a path is work that grows harder with every step. For a moment, Laura thought of excusing Martha and Charles this one time, but that would not be honest. No excuse could change the fact they were tardy. I'm sorry, I must mark you tardy, she said, but you may come to the stove and get warm before you take your seat. We're sorry, Miss Ingalls, Martha said. We didn't know it would take so long. Breaking a path is hard work, I know, said Laura. And suddenly she and Martha were smiling at each other, a friendly smile that made Laura feel as if teaching school were easy. She said, Second reader class, rise, pass to the front. And Ruby, the second reader class, rose and came to stand before her. The whole morning went smoothly. At noon, Ruby came to Laura's desk and shyly offered her a cookie. After dinners were eaten from the dinner pails, Clarence asked her to come out and snowball, and Martha said, Please do, then we will have 3 on a side. Laura was so pleased to be asked, and so eager to be out in the sunshine and clean snow that she went. It was great fun. She and Martha and Ruby fought against Charles, Clarence, and Tommy. The air was full of snowballs. Clarence and Laura were quickest of all, dodging and scooping and molding snow with their mittened hands and throwing and dodging again. Laura was glowing warm and laughing when a great burst of snow exploded in her eyes and her open mouth and plastered her whole face. Oh, gee, I didn't mean to, she heard Clarence saying. Yes, you did. It was a fair hit, Laura answered, blindly rubbing her eyes. Here, let me stand still, he said. He took hold of her shoulder as if she were Ruby and wiped her face with the end of her muffler. Thank you, Laura said, but she knew that she must not play anymore. She was too small and too young. She would not be able to keep her pupils in order if she played games with them. That very afternoon, Clarence pulled Martha's hair. Her brown braid whisked across his desk as she turned her head, and he caught it and gave it a tug. Clarence, Laura said, do not disturb Martha. Give your attention to your lessons. He gave her a friendly grin that said as plainly as words, All right, if you say so, I don't have to. To her horror, Laura almost smiled. Barely in time, she kept her look stern. Now she was sure that she would have trouble with Clarence. Wednesday was gone. There was only Thursday and Friday. Laura tried not to expect that Pa would come for her, but she could not stop hoping. It would be so like Pa to come and save her from a miserable 2 days at Mrs. Brewster's house. But of course he did not know how miserable it was. She must not expect him. But surely he might come if the weather was good. If he came, there were only 2 more evenings to endure, and then Friday night at home. Still, she did not expect him. She must not, or she would be so disappointed if he did not come. They were missing her at home, she knew. If the weather were pleasant, surely he would come. But Friday morning, the sky was stormy and the wind was colder. All day at school, Laura listened to the wind, afraid that its sound would change to a blizzard's howl and the shanty suddenly shake and the window go blank. The wind blew colder through the cracks. Its sound rose, and from every drift the snow scudded across the prairie. Laura knew now that Pa would not come. 24 miles in such weather was too much for the horses. How am I going to get through the times till Monday? Laura thought. Wretchedly, she turned her eyes from the window and saw Clarence sitting half asleep. Suddenly, he jumped wide awake. Clarence had jabbed his arm with a pin. Laura almost laughed, but Clarence caught her glance and his eyes laughed. She could not let this pass. Clarence, she said, why aren't you studying? I know all my lessons, he replied. She did not doubt it. Clarence learned quickly. He could keep up with Martha and Charles and have plenty of idle time. We will see how well you know your spelling, she said. She tapped upon her table. Third spelling class, rise, come forward. The shanty trembled in the wind that every moment howled louder around it. Heat from the red-cheeked stove melted the snow that was blown through the cracks and made wet streaks on the floor. Clarence correctly spelled every word that Laura gave him, while she wondered whether she should dismiss school early. If she waited and the storm grew worse, Charles and Martha might never reach their home. It seemed to her that the wind had a strangely silvery sound. She listened. They all listened. She did not know what to make of it. The sky was not changed. Gray, low clouds were moving fast above the prairie, covered with blowing snow. The strange sound grew clearer, almost like music. Suddenly, the whole air filled with the chiming of little bells. Sleigh bells! Everyone breathed again and smiled. Two brown horses swiftly passed the window. Laura knew them. They were Prince and Lady, young Mr. Wilder's horses. The sleigh bells rang louder and stopped. Then a few bells shook out small tinkles. The brown horses were standing close outside the south wall in the shelter of the shanty. Laura was so excited that she had to steady her voice. The class may be seated. She waited a moment, then. You may all put away your books. It is a little early, but the storm is growing worse. School is dismissed. Little House on the Prairie series by Laura Ingalls Wilder. Book 8, These Happy Golden Years. Chapter 4, Sleigh Bells. Clarence dashed outdoors and back again shouting, It's someone for you, teacher. Laura was helping Ruby into her coat. Tell him I will be there in a minute. Come on, Charles, you ought to see his horses. Clarence slammed the door so that the shanty shook. Laura quickly put on her coat and tied her hood and muffler. She shut the stove's drafts, thrust her hands into her mittens, and took her books and dinner pail. She made sure the door was fastened behind her. All the time, she was so excited that she could hardly breathe. Pa had not come, but she was going home after all. Almanzo Wilder was sitting in a cutter so low and small that it was hardly more than a heap of furs on the snow behind Prince and Lady. He was muffled in a buffalo coat and a fur cap with flaps that was as snug as a hood. He did not step out into the storm. Instead, he lifted the fur robes and gave Laura his hand to help her step into the cutter. Then he tucked the robes around her. They were furry, warm buffalo skins lined with flannel. You want to stop at Brewster's? He asked. I must, to leave the dinner pail and get my satchel, Laura said. In the Brewster house, Johnny was screaming angrily, and when Laura came out of the house, she saw Almanzo looking at it with disgust. But it was all behind her now. She was going home. Almanzo tucked the robes snugly around her. The sleigh bells began merrily ringing, and swiftly behind the brown horses, she was going home. She said, through her thick black woolen veil, It's nice of you to come for me. I was hoping Pa would come. Almanzo hesitated. Well, yeah. He was figuring he would, but I told him it's a drive that would be pretty hard on his team. They'll have to bring me back, Laura said doubtfully. I must be at school Monday morning. Maybe Prince and Lady could make the drive again, Almanzo said. Laura was embarrassed. She had not meant to hint. She had not even thought of his bringing her back. Again, she had spoken before she thought. How right Pa's advice had been. She should always, always think before she spoke. She thought, after this, I shall always think before I speak. And she said, without thinking how rude it would sound, Oh, you needn't bother. Pa will bring me back. It would be no bother, Almanzo said. I told you I'd take you for a sleigh ride when I got my cutter made. This is the cutter. How do you like it? I think it's fun to ride in. It's so little, Laura answered. I made it smaller than the Botten ones. It's only 5 feet long and 26 inches wide at the bottom. Makes it snugger to ride in and lighter for the horses to pull, Almanzo explained. They hardly know they're pulling anything. It's like flying, Laura said. She'd never imagined such wonderful speed. The low clouds raced backward overhead, the blown snow smoked backward on either side, and swiftly onward went the glossy brown horses, streaming music from their strings of bells. There was not a jolt nor a jar. The little cutters skimmed the snow as smoothly as a bird in air. Almost too soon, though not soon enough, they were flashing past the windows of Main Street, and here was Pa's front door again, opening, and Pa standing in it. Laura was out of the cutter and up the steps before she thought. Then, "Oh, thank you, Mr. Wilder. Good night," she called back all in a breath, and she was at home. Ma's smile lighted her whole face. Carrie came running to unwind Laura's muffler and veil, while Grace clapped her hands and shouted, "Laura's come home." Then Pa came in and said,
"Let's look at you. Well, well, the same little Flutterbudget."
There was so much to say and to tell. The big sitting room had never looked so beautiful. The walls were dark brown now. Every year, the pine boards grew darker. The table was covered with the red-checked cloth, and the braided rag rugs were gray on the floor. The rocking chairs stood by the white-curtained windows, Mary's boughten chair and the willow chair that Pa had made for Ma so long ago in the Indian Territory. The patchwork cushions were in them, and there was Ma's work basket and her knitting with the needles thrust into the ball of yarn. Kitty lazily stretched and yawned and came to curve, purring against Laura's ankles. And there on Pa's desk was the blue bead basket that Mary had made. The talking went on at the supper table. Laura was more hungry for talk than food. She told about each one of her pupils at school, and Ma told of Mary's latest letter. Mary was doing so well in the college for the blind in Iowa. Carrie told all the news of the school in town. Grace told of the words she had learned to read and of Kitty's last fight with a dog. After supper, when Laura and Carrie had done the dishes, Pa said to Laura, as Laura had been hoping he would,
"If you'll bring me the fiddle, Laura, we'll have a little music."
He played the brave marching songs of Scotland and of the United States. He played the sweet old love songs and the gay dance tunes, and Laura was so happy that her throat ached. When it was bedtime and she went upstairs with Carrie and Grace, she looked from the attic window at the lights of the town twinkling here and there through the wind and the blowing snow. As she snuggled under quilts, she heard Pa and Ma coming up to their room at the head of the stairs. She heard Ma's pleasant low voice and Pa's deeper one answering it, and she was so glad to be home for 2 nights and nearly 2 days that she could hardly go to sleep. Even her sleep was deep and good, without fear of falling off a narrow sofa. Almost at once, it seemed her eyes open. She heard the stove lid rattle downstairs and knew that she was at home. "Good morning," Carrie said from her bed, and Grace bounced up and cried, "Good morning, Laura." "Good morning." Ma smiled when Laura entered the kitchen, and Pa came in with the milk and said,
"Good morning, Flutterbudget."
Laura had never noticed before that saying good morning made the morning good. Anyway, she was learning something from that Mrs. Brewster, she thought. Breakfast was so pleasant. Then briskly and still talking, Laura and Carrie did the dishes and went upstairs to make the beds. While they were tucking in a sheet, Laura said, "Carrie, do you ever think how lucky we are to have a home like this?" Carrie looked around her, surprised. There was nothing to be seen but the 2 beds and the 3 boxes under the eaves where they kept their things, and the underside of the shingles overhead. There was also the stovepipes that came to the floor and went up through the roof. "It is snug," Carrie said, while they spread the first quilt and folded and tucked it in its corners. "I guess I never did think exactly." "You wait till you go away," Laura said, "then you'll think." "Do you dreadfully hate to teach school?" Carrie asked her low. "Yes, I do," Laura almost whispered, "but Pa and Ma mustn't know." They plumped up the pillows and set them in their places and went to Laura's bed. "Maybe you won't have too long," Carrie consoled her. They unbuttoned the straw tick and thrust their arms deep into it, stirring up the straw. "Maybe you'll get married. Ma did." "I don't want to," Laura said. She patted the tick smooth and buttoned it. "There, now the bottom quilt. I'd rather stay home than anything." "Always?" Carrie asked. "Yes, always," Laura said, and she meant it with all her heart. She spread the sheet. "But I can't, not all the time. I have to go on teaching school." They tucked in the quilts and plumped up Laura's pillow. The beds were done. Carrie said she would do the sweeping. "I always do now," she said, "and if you're going to marry Powers, the sooner you go, the sooner you'll be back." I only have to find out if I'm keeping up with my class, Laura said. Downstairs, she set the wash boiler on the stove and filled it with pails of water from the well. Then, while it was heating, she went to see Mary Power. She'd quite forgotten that she had ever disliked the town. It was bright and brisk this morning. Sunlight glinted on the icy ruts of snow in the street and sparkled on the frosty edges of the board sidewalk. In the 2 blocks, there were only 2 vacant lots on the west side of the street now, and some of the stores were painted white or gray. Hawthorne's grocery was painted red. Everywhere there was the stir and bustle of morning. The storekeepers in thick coats and caps were scraping trodden bits of snow from the sidewalks before their stores and talking and joking as they worked. Doors slammed, hens cackled, and horses whinnied in the stables. Mr. Fuller and then Mr. Bradley lifted their caps and said good morning to Laura as she passed. Mr. Bradley said, "I hear you're teaching Brewster School, Miss Ingalls." Laura felt very grown up. "Yes," she said. "I'm in town only over Saturday." "Well, I wish you all success," said Mr. Bradley. "Thank you, Mr. Bradley," said Laura. In Mr. Power's tailor's shop, Mary's father was sitting cross-legged on his table, sewing busily. Mary was helping her mother with the morning's work in the back room. "Well, look who's here," Mrs. Power exclaimed. "How's the school teacher?" "Very well, thank you," Laura said. "Do you like teaching school?" Mary wanted to know. "I'm getting along all right, I guess," Laura said, "but I'd rather be home. I'll be glad when the 2 months are over." "So will all of us," Mary told her. "My, we do miss you at school." Laura was pleased. "Do you?" she said. "I miss you too." "Nellie Olson tried to get your seat," Mary went on, "but Ida wouldn't let her. Ida said she's keeping that seat for you till you come back, and Mr. Owen said she can." "Whatever did Nellie Olson want my seat for?" Laura exclaimed. "Hers is just as good, or almost." "That's Nellie for you," said Mary. "She just wants anything that anybody else has, that's all. Oh, Laura, she'll be fit to be tied when I tell her that Almanzo Wilder brought you home in his new cutter." They both laughed. Laura felt a little ashamed, but she could not help laughing. They remembered Nellie's bragging that she was going to ride behind those brown horses. She never had done it yet. "I can hardly wait," Mary said. Mrs. Powers said, "I don't think that's very nice, Mary." "I know it isn't," Mary admitted. "But if you only knew how that Nellie Olson always was bragging and showing off and picking on Laura. And now to think that Laura's teaching school and Almanzo Wilder's beauing her home." "Oh, no, he isn't," Laura cried. "It isn't like that at all. He came for me as a favor to Pa." Mary laughed. "He must think a lot of your Pa," she began to tease. Then she looked at Laura and said, "I'm sorry. I won't talk about it if you don't want to." "I don't mean that," Laura said. "Everything is simple when you are alone or at home, but as soon as you meet other people, you are in difficulties. I just don't want you to think Mr. Wilder's my wash water on, because he must be hot now. Tell me where you are in your lessons, Mary." And I only ran in for a minute. Laura saw that she was keeping up with the class by her studying at night. Then she went home. All that day was such a happy time. Laura did her washing and sprinkled and ironed the clean, fresh clothes. Then in the cozy sitting room, she ripped her beautiful brown velvet hat, talking all the time with Ma and Carrie and Grace. She brushed and steamed the velvet and draped it again over the buckram frame and tied it on. It looked like a new hat, even more becoming than before. There was just time enough to brush and sponge and press her brown dress, and then to help Ma to get an early supper. Afterward, they all bathed, one by one, in the warm kitchen and went to bed. "If I could only live like this always, I'd never want anything more," Laura thought as she went to sleep. "But maybe I appreciate it more because I've only tonight and tomorrow morning." The morning sunshine and the sky had their quiet Sunday look, and the town was quiet with a Sunday stillness when Laura and Carrie and Grace and Ma sedately went out on Sunday morning. The morning work was done. The beans for Sunday dinner were baking slowly in the oven. Pa carefully closed the heating stove's drafts and came out and locked the door. Laura and Carrie went ahead. Pa and Ma came behind them, holding Grace's hands. All fresh and clean and dressed in Sunday best, they walked slowly in the cold Sunday morning, taking care not to slip on the icy paths. Carefully along the street, in single file across lots behind Fuller's store, everyone else was going toward the church too. As she went on, Laura looked eagerly over the partly filled seats, and there was Ida. Ida's brown eyes danced when she saw Laura, and she slid along the seat to make room and gave Laura's arm a squeeze. My, I'm glad to see you, she whispered. When did you come? Friday after school. I've got to go back this afternoon, Laura answered. There was a little time to talk before Sunday school. Do you like teaching? Ida asked. No, I do not. But don't tell anybody else. I'm getting along all right so far. I won't, Ida promised. I knew you would. But your place at school is awfully empty. I'll be back. It's only 7 more weeks, Laura said. Laura, Ida said, you don't care if Nellie Olson sits with me while you're gone, do you? Why, Ida Brown, Laura began. Then she saw that Ida was only teasing. Of course not, she said. You ask her and see if she will. Because they were in church and could not laugh, they sat silently shaking and almost choking in their effort to keep their faces sober. Lawyer Barnes was rapping the pulpit to bring the Sunday school to order, and they could not talk any more. They must rise and join in the singing. Sweet Sabbath school, more dear to me than fairest palace dome. My heart e'er turns with joy to thee, my own dear Sabbath home. Singing together was even better than talking. Ida was such a dear, Laura thought, as they stood side by side, holding the hymn book open before them. Here first my wilful, wandering heart, the way of life was shown. Here first I sought the better part, and gained a Sabbath home. Clear and sure, Laura's voice held the note, while Ida's soft alto chimed, Sabbath home. Then their voices blended again. My heart e'er turns with joy to thee, my own dear Sabbath home. Sunday school was the pleasant part of church. Though they could talk only to the teacher about the lesson, Ida and Laura could smile at each other and sing together. When Sunday school ended, there was only time to say, goodbye, goodbye. Then Ida must sit with Mrs. Brown in the front seat while Reverend Brown preached one of his long, stupid sermons. Laura and Carrie went to sit with Pa and Ma and Grace. Laura made sure that she remembered the text to repeat at home when Pa asked her. Then she need not listen any more. She always missed Mary in church. Mary had always sat so properly beside her, watchful that Laura behaved. It was strange to think that they had been little girls, and now Mary was in college and Laura was a school teacher. She tried not to think of Mrs. Brewster's and of school. After all, Mary had gone to college, and now Laura was earning $40. With $40, Mary could surely stay in college next year. Maybe everything comes out all right if you keep on trying. Anyway, you have to keep on trying. Nothing will come out right if you don't. If I can only manage Clarence for 7 weeks more, Laura thought. Carrie pinched her arm. Everyone was standing up to sing the doxology. Church was over. Dinner was good. Ma's baked beans were delicious, and the bread and butter and little cucumber pickles, and everyone was so comfortable and so cheerful and talking. Laura said, oh, I do like it here.
It's too bad that Brewster's isn't a better place to stay,
said Pa. Why, Pa, I haven't complained, Laura said in surprise.
I know you haven't,
said Pa.
Well, keep a stiff upper lip. 7 weeks will soon be gone, and you'll be home again.
How pleasant it was after the dishes were done when they were all settled in the front room for Sunday afternoon. Sunshine streamed through the clean windows into the warm room where Ma sat gently rocking, and Carrie and Grace pored over the pictures in Pa's big green book, The Wonders of the Animal World. Pa read items from the Pioneer Press to Ma, and at his desk, Laura sat writing a letter to Mary. Carefully, with Ma's little pearl-handled pen that was shaped like a feather, she wrote of her school and her pupils. Of course, she wrote of nothing unpleasant. The clock ticked, and now and then Kitty lazily stretched and purred a short purr. When the letter was finished, Laura went upstairs and packed her clean clothes in Ma's satchel. She brought it downstairs and into the front room. It must be time to go, but Pa sat reading his paper and took no notice. Ma looked at the clock and said gently, Charles, surely you must hitch up or you'll be late starting. It's a long way to go and come, and dark comes early nowadays. Pa turned a page of the paper and said,
Oh, there's no hurry.
Laura and Ma looked at each other in amazement. They looked at the clock and again at Pa. He did not stir, but his brown beard had a smiling look. Laura sat down. The clock ticked, and Pa silently read the paper. Twice, Ma almost spoke and changed her mind. At last, not looking up, Pa said,
Some folks worry about my team.
Why, Charles, there isn't anything wrong with the horses, Ma exclaimed.
Well,
said Pa,
they're not as young as they used to be, for a fact. They can still hold out pretty well, though, for 12 miles and back.
Charles, Ma said helplessly. Pa looked up at Laura, and his eyes were twinkling.
Maybe I don't have to drive them so far,
he said. Sleigh bells were coming down the street. Clearer and louder they came, then rang all at once and stopped by the door. Pa went to the door and opened it. Good afternoon, Mr. Ingalls, Laura heard Almanzo Wilder say. I stopped by to see if Laura would let me drive her out to her school.
Why, I'm sure she'd like a ride in that cutter,
Pa replied. It's getting late and too cold to tie him without blanketing, Almanzo said. I'll drive down the street and stop on my way back.
I'll tell her,
Pa answered and shut the door while the bells jingled away.
How about it, Laura?
It is fun to ride in a cutter, Laura said. Quickly, she tied on her hood and got into her coat. The bells were coming. She had hardly time to say goodbye before they stopped at the door. Don't forget the satchel, Ma said, and Laura turned back to snatch it up. Thank you, Ma. Goodbye, she said, and went out to the cutter. Almanzo helped her in and tucked the robes around her. Prince and lady started quickly. All the bells rang out their music, and she was on her way back to her school.